I let a terrified stranger stay at my house, then found out who was hunting them. Please, I just need somewhere safe until morning. The woman at my door looked maybe 26. Holding a crying baby against her shoulder, rain had soaked through her thin jacket, and mascara streaked down her cheeks in dark lines. It was past midnight on a Thursday, and I lived alone in a quiet residential neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happened, but something about her desperation made me step aside and let her in without hesitation. She introduced herself as Mia, and the baby was her 8-month-old son, Connor. While I grabbed towels and started making tea, she told me her story in fragments between trying to soothe the crying infant. Her husband, Alex, had become increasingly controlling over the past year, monitoring her phone, isolating her from friends and family, flying into rages over small things. Tonight had been the breaking point when he'd threatened to hurt Connor if she ever tried to leave him. I waited until he passed out drunk, Mia said, bouncing Connor gently as his cries finally subsided into hiccups. Grabbed the diaper bag and just ran. I don't have anywhere to go. No money of my own. Nothing. He controls all our accounts. She showed me her phone. The screen cracked from when Alex had thrown it against the wall earlier that evening. Despite the damage, I could see missed calls from a contact labeled Alex, with an angry emoji. 17 calls in the last 2 hours alone. I told her she could stay as long as needed and helped her set up a makeshift bed for Connor using couch cushions and my extra blankets. She seemed genuinely grateful, but remained jumpy, checking the windows every few minutes and flinching at small sounds from outside around 2 a.m. Connor finally fell asleep, and Mia collapsed into exhausted silence on my couch, though her eyes never quite closed completely throughout the night. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and found Mia already dressed, Connor fed and content in his carrier. She'd cleaned my kitchen and folded the blankets we'd used, moving around my space with surprising familiarity for someone who'd never been there before. When I commented on how helpful she was being, she smiled and said she'd always been good at making herself useful, a skill learned from years of walking on eggshells around Alex. Over breakfast, Mia showed me more evidence of Alex's abuse, photos on her phone of bruises on her arms and shoulders, screenshots of threatening texts, even a recording of him screaming at her that she'd made secretly during one of his worst episodes. Everything looked authentic and painted a clear picture of escalating domestic violence. She knew all the right terminology, spoke about the cycle of abuse with the fluency of someone who'd researched her situation extensively online. I called the domestic violence hotline yesterday, she said, bouncing Connor absently while he played with a colorful toy. They said I could stay in a shelter, but I'm scared he'll find me there. Alex has connections everywhere in this town, and I don't trust that I'd be safe. The fear in her voice seemed genuine, and when Connor started fussing, she immediately shifted into soothing mother mode, singing softly while she prepared his bottle with practiced efficiency. By the second day, I'd begun to notice small details about Mia that impressed me. She never left Connor alone, not even for a few minutes, and seemed to anticipate his needs before he even started crying. When I offered to hold him while she showered, she hesitated for a long moment before agreeing, and I could hear her singing in the bathroom, probably to comfort herself as much as to let Connor know she was nearby. Mia also proved to be an excellent cook, somehow creating delicious meals from my limited pantry supplies. She made homemade baby food for Connor using vegetables I hadn't even realized I had, blending everything to the perfect consistency. When I asked where she'd learned to cook so well, she said Alex had expected gourmet meals every night but refused to let her take cooking classes, so she'd taught herself through online videos. On the third day, Mia received a call that made her face go white with terror. She answered hesitantly, and I could hear a man's voice shouting through the phone, though I couldn't make out the words. After less than 30 seconds, she hung up and immediately powered off the device entirely. Her hands shook as she explained that Alex had somehow gotten a new number and was making increasingly specific threats about what he'd do when he found her. He said he knows I'm somewhere in the neighborhood, Mia whispered, checking the locks on my doors for the third time that day. He's driving around looking for me. If he finds me here, I don't know what he'll do to you for helping me. The genuine concern for my safety in her voice made me feel protective of both her and Connor. I reassured her that we'd call the police if Alex showed up, but privately I began keeping my phone charged and within reach at all times. That evening, Mia opened up more about her relationship with Alex. She described how charming he'd been during their early dating period, showering her with gifts and attention, making her feel like the most important person in the world. The controlling behavior had started gradually, small requests that seemed reasonable at first, but eventually became a web of restrictions that trapped her completely in their shared life. He convinced me to quit my job after Connor was born, she said, watching her son sleep peacefully in his makeshift crib. Said a good mother should focus entirely on her family, but then he'd criticize everything I did at home, how I cleaned, how I dressed, even how I held the baby. Nothing was ever good enough, and I started believing maybe I really was failing at everything. Mia also told me about Alex's family, who had welcomed her warmly at first, but gradually became distant as Alex poisoned them against her with lies about her behavior. His mother, Patricia, had been particularly close to Mia initially, but now barely acknowledged her existence at family gatherings. Alex had convinced everyone that Mia was unstable and attention-seeking, making it impossible for her to reach out for help without seeming to prove his point. By the fourth day, I'd grown genuinely attached to both of them. Connor was a sweet baby with bright blue eyes and a laugh that made my whole apartment feel warmer. He'd started reaching for me when I walked into a room, babbling happily while I made faces at him. Mia had relaxed enough to laugh occasionally, and I caught glimpses of who she might have been before Alex destroyed her confidence and isolated her from the world. Mia helped with household chores without being asked, cooked dinner every night, and proved to be surprisingly good company once she began feeling safer. She told me about her childhood in Oregon, her college years studying education, how she'd met Alex at a coffee shop where she was grading papers and thought he was charming and protective rather than possessive and controlling. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," she said one evening, while Connor played on a blanket nearby. "All the red flags I ignored because I wanted so badly to believe he loved me." She described how Alex had gradually isolated her from her support system, convincing her that her family and friends didn't understand their relationship and were jealous of what they shared together. On the 5th day, Mia's anxiety spiked when she thought she saw Alex's car in the parking lot outside my building. We spent an hour watching from my window, but the blue sedan she'd pointed out never moved, and eventually we realized it belonged to one of my neighbors. Still, the incident left her shaken and hypervigilant for the rest of the day, jumping at every sound and constantly peering through the blinds. That night, Connor came down with a mild fever, and watching Mia care for him revealed another layer of her character. She stayed awake all night monitoring his temperature, giving him medicine at precise intervals, and calling a nurse helpline twice to make sure she was handling everything correctly. Her devotion to Connor's well-being was absolute, and seeing her maternal instincts in action made her story even more heartbreaking. By the 6th day, I was actively helping Mia research legal options for escaping her situation permanently. We looked into restraining orders, divorce procedures, and custody rights, though everything seemed complicated by her lack of financial resources and documented evidence of Alex's threats. Mia seemed grateful for my help, but grew increasingly worried that she was putting me in danger by staying so long. "Maybe I should just go to the shelter," she said, though I could see the fear in her eyes at the thought. "Alex is persistent. If he doesn't find me soon, he might start looking into who's helping me, and I can't let him hurt you because of my problems." Her willingness to sacrifice her own safety for mine only strengthened my resolve to help her find a permanent solution to her situation. That evening, we called the domestic violence hotline together, and the counselor walked us through Mia's options in detail. She could enter a shelter program that would eventually help her relocate to another state with a new identity if necessary, but the process would take weeks and require her to cut all contact with anyone from her previous life, including me. The thought of losing touch with Mia and Connor made me surprisingly sad. On the 7th day, exactly a week after Mia had arrived, my doorbell rang while I was getting ready for work. Through the peephole, I saw a woman who looked almost exactly like Mia, standing next to a tall man with kind eyes and an expensive suit. My first thought was that Mia had a sister she hadn't mentioned, but something about their body language made me pause before opening the door. They weren't standing like people who were friends or partners. The woman kept glancing at the man nervously, and he had the rigid posture of someone barely containing strong emotions. Both of them looked exhausted, like they'd been searching for something important for a long time. The woman's eyes were red from crying, and the man kept clenching and unclenching his hands at his sides. "Is Mia here?" the woman asked when I finally opened the door. "We're her sister Elena and her brother-in-law David. We've been looking for her for days. We're worried sick." Elena's voice had the same soft quality as Mia's, but her eyes held an intensity that made me uncomfortable. David stepped forward slightly, and I noticed his hands were trembling despite his otherwise calm demeanor. I called for Mia, and when she appeared in the hallway behind me, her face went completely white. But instead of relief or joy at seeing family members, her expression showed pure terror. Connor, who had been babbling happily in her arms, began crying as if sensing her distress. Elena's face crumpled with what looked like grief and anger combined, while David's jaw tightened visibly. "Where is she?" Elena asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "Where's my baby sister Rachel?" Mia's grip on Connor tightened, and she took a step backward toward my living room. The accusation hung in the air like a physical weight, and suddenly the comfortable dynamic I'd shared with Mia for a week felt like it was built on quicksand. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mia said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried all week when discussing her situation with Alex. Connor's cries grew more distressed, and she began bouncing him frantically, but her movements seemed more agitated than soothing. Elena stepped closer, and I could see the family resemblance clearly now, the same bone structure and coloring, though Elena looked healthier, less gaunt than Mia had when she first arrived. 3 weeks ago, our sister-in-law Rachel called us. Terrified, she said her twin sister had been showing up places, following her, making threats. Rachel was planning to get a restraining order, but then she disappeared. Her apartment was cleaned out, and no one has seen her since. He gestured toward Mia with a shaking hand. Except for Connor, Rachel's son Connor, who should be with his mother. The pieces clicked together in my mind with horrifying clarity. The woman I'd been harboring wasn't the victim of domestic abuse she'd claimed to be. The crying baby I'd helped care for wasn't her son but her nephew, taken from his real mother who was now missing. Elena confirmed my worst fears when she pulled out her phone, showing me photos of herself with a woman who looked identical to Mia, but with a warmth in her eyes that Mia had never quite managed to replicate. "This is Rachel," Elena said, swiping through pictures of family gatherings, birthday parties, everyday moments that spoke of a life filled with genuine love and connection. "My twin sister, Connor's mother. The woman you've been helping is Stella, Rachel's identical twin. They haven't spoken in 3 years because Stella has a history of identity theft and manipulation. She's been obsessed with Rachel's life, with having everything that Rachel has." Elena's hands shook as she continued scrolling through the photos. More pictures revealed the truth I'd been blind to all week. Rachel with David at their wedding, both of them glowing with happiness. Rachel in the hospital holding newborn Connor, exhausted but radiant with joy. Rachel and Connor at a park, both of them laughing as she pushed him on a baby swing. In every image, Rachel's expressions were natural and unguarded, completely different from the careful mask Stella had worn during our week together. Rachel was so happy with David, with baby Connor, Elena continued, her voice thick with tears. She'd finally found the family she'd always wanted after years of Stella's manipulations and lies, and now she's gone, and this monster has taken her place like it's some kind of game. Elena's grief transformed into rage as she stared at Stella, who had retreated further into my apartment, still clutching Connor protectively. David stepped forward, his composure finally cracking completely. Rachel called me the night she disappeared, said Stella had been leaving gifts outside our apartment, following her to the grocery store, even showing up at Connor's pediatrician appointments claiming to be his aunt. She was terrified, but I told her to call the police in the morning. I should have taken it more seriously, should have protected them better. Stella, who I'd known as Mia, finally dropped the act entirely. Her posture straightened, the nervous energy I'd attributed to trauma replaced by something calculated and cold. Connor had quieted in her arms, but she held him like a possession rather than a child she loved. When she spoke, her voice had lost its vulnerable quality entirely, replaced by something flat and emotionless. Rachel always had everything, Stella said, almost conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than her sister's disappearance. Perfect husband, perfect house, perfect baby. She didn't deserve any of it. She was weak, always complaining about how hard motherhood was, how tired she felt all the time. I would have been a better mother to Connor. I am a better mother to Connor. The casual way she discussed taking over her sister's life made my skin crawl. Elena pulled out her phone and showed me more evidence of Stella's deception. Screenshots of social media posts where Stella had been systematically studying Rachel's life for months, learning her routines, her preferences, even her way of speaking. Security camera footage from Rachel's apartment building showing Stella following her sister and taking notes on her daily activities like some kind of predator studying prey. She's done this before, Elena said, scrolling through what looked like police reports and court documents. Identity theft, credit card fraud, even stalking charges from previous boyfriends' ex-girlfriends. But this time was different because she found the perfect target. Someone who looked exactly like her and had everything she wanted. Someone vulnerable because she trusted family. David's voice shook with barely controlled fury as he continued the story. Rachel had been trying to reconnect with Stella over the past year, despite everything. She felt guilty about cutting contact and thought maybe Stella had changed, especially after Connor was born. Rachel wanted her son to know his aunt, wanted to give Stella another chance to be part of their family. That kindness is what got her killed. If anything, she seemed pleased that her deception had worked so well for so long. She'd been living in Rachel's apartment for 3 weeks, sleeping in Rachel's bed, wearing Rachel's clothes, even using Rachel's credit cards and identification documents. The domestic violence story she'd told me was fabricated entirely, assembled from online resources and support group forums to create maximum sympathy. I studied everything, Stella said with something approaching pride. Rachel's mannerisms, her voice, the way she held Connor, even her cooking preferences. I was better at being Rachel than Rachel was. David never would have known if these two hadn't started asking questions. She gestured dismissively toward Elena and David, as if their grief and desperation were merely inconveniences in her elaborate performance. Elena was already calling 911, her voice shaking as she reported kidnapping and possible homicide. Stella made no move to run or hide, instead cooing softly to Connor as if nothing unusual was happening when I tried to approach her. Thinking maybe I could convince her to hand over the baby, she stepped back and held Connor tighter, her grip possessive and threatening. "You don't understand," Stella said, looking directly at me with eyes that held no warmth despite the week we'd spent together. "I gave you exactly what you wanted, a victim to save, a baby to protect, a chance to be the hero. You loved every minute of it, didn't you? Feeling needed? Feeling important? I made you feel good about yourself. And in return, you helped me perfect my performance as Rachel." The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Stella had used my genuine desire to help someone in crisis as a rehearsal for her stolen identity, practicing her victim persona while I unknowingly validated her performance. Every moment of connection I'd felt with her had been calculated. Every vulnerability she'd shared had been designed to make me more invested in protecting her and Connor from a threat that didn't exist. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they found Stella sitting calmly on my couch, still holding Connor but no longer bothering to maintain her frightened victim act. She went with them quietly, surrendering Connor only when a social worker gently removed him from her arms. Watching Connor reach for David with recognition in his eyes confirmed everything Elena had told me about their true relationship. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Stella's deception and the horrifying fate of her sister Rachel. Security cameras from Rachel's apartment building showed Stella arriving on the night of the disappearance with cleaning supplies and a large suitcase she'd entered using a key she'd stolen weeks earlier during one of her stalking visits, then spent hours methodically erasing evidence of Rachel's existence from the apartment. Rachel's body was found in a storage unit Stella had rented 3 states away, and evidence in Stella's own apartment showed months of planning to assume her sister's identity permanently. She'd been studying Rachel's life through social media, learning her routines, even practicing her mannerisms in front of mirrors. Credit card records showed Stella had been gradually purchasing items identical to Rachel's wardrobe and personal effects. The most disturbing evidence was a journal Stella had kept documenting her sister's daily routine with clinical precision. She'd noted everything from Rachel's preferred grocery stores to her exercise schedule to the specific way she interacted with Connor during different activities. The entries read like a predator's manual for assuming someone else's life, complete with detailed observations about Rachel's relationships and emotional vulnerabilities. For a week, I'd harbored a killer and helped her maintain possession of her victim's child, while she perfected her impersonation of the woman she'd murdered. The realization that Connor's occasional crying hadn't been from sensing his caregiver's distress, but from missing his real mother haunted me for months afterward. Every moment I'd spent bonding with him had been built on his tragic loss. Elena and David visited me once after Stella's arrest to thank me for calling the police and to let me know Connor was adjusting well to life with his father and aunt. But I could see the unspoken question in their eyes about how I'd been so thoroughly fooled by someone who had murdered their beloved family member. Their grief was compounded by knowing that Stella had been playing house with Connor, while Rachel's body lay decomposing in storage. During our conversation, Elena shared more details about Rachel's life that made Stella's crime even more heartbreaking. Rachel had been a kindergarten teacher who volunteered at animal shelters on weekends, someone who sent birthday cards to distant cousins, and always remembered to call her grandparents every Sunday. She'd been planning Connor's first birthday party when Stella killed her, excited about introducing him to solid foods and watching him take his first steps. Rachel was everything Stella pretended to be, Elena said, tears flowing freely as she held Connor close. Genuinely kind, naturally maternal, loved by everyone who knew her, Stella could imitate Rachel's appearance and mannerisms, but she could never replicate the warmth that made Rachel special. The fact that she thought she could just step into Rachel's life shows how little she understood about what made her sister irreplaceable. 6 months later, Stella was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, evidence emerged that Rachel wasn't her first victim, just the most elaborate and personal she'd been assuming other people's identities for years, though never with such devastating consequences. Previous victims included college roommates, coworkers, and even casual acquaintances whose lives had appealed to her for various reasons. The prosecutor called it the most calculated case of sibling rivalry he'd ever seen, but that clinical description felt inadequate for the evil I'd witnessed firsthand. Stella had destroyed an entire family's future, leaving Connor to grow up without his mother and David to raise their son alone while grieving his murdered wife. The ripple effects of her selfishness would continue for generations. Connor would grow up never knowing his mother except through stories and photographs, raised by people who loved him deeply, but could never replace what he'd lost. Elena moved in with David to help care for Connor, and they slowly began rebuilding their shattered lives around the needs of a child who would never understand why his mother had disappeared from his world so suddenly. I still think about that week sometimes, how easily I was manipulated by someone who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push to gain my trust and cooperation. The worst part wasn't that I'd been fooled, but that my desire to help someone in crisis had been weaponized against an innocent child, and his murdered mother Stella had turned my compassion into an unwitting tool for perfecting her impersonation of Rachel. Elena sends me Christmas cards with photos of Connor, and while I'm grateful he's thriving with David and his aunt, each picture reminds me that some predators are skilled enough to turn our best instincts against us. Connor is walking now, talking in simple sentences, and seems happy despite the trauma that shaped his earliest months. But I know that someday, David and Elena will have to explain why his mother isn't coming home, and I played an unknowing role in that conversation becoming necessary. The experience changed how I view offers to help strangers, adding layers of caution and verification that probably make me less effective at genuine crisis intervention. But it also taught me that evil sometimes wears the face of vulnerability, and the most dangerous predators are those who can convincingly imitate the victims they destroy. Stella's week in my home was a masterclass in manipulation, and Connor paid the ultimate price for my education in human cruelty.